Paula Coomer, and I am today to talk to Karen Vorbeck Williams, who is the author of the memoir Pretty. I'm hoping everybody can see that cover. How's it showing up there? Yeah. Um, and Pretty is a memoir that was published by Fox Press. When did it come out, Karen?
Hi, Paula. Thank you for doing this. The book came out in November of 2019.
Okay.
And yeah, that's when it came out.
Okay.
I have a couple of other books that I've written, and they're all now published by Fox Press. One is a historical fiction about an ancestor of mine who was accused of witchcraft in 1675, and then another is my attempt at writing a mystery in honor of my love of Nancy Drew mysteries. So there's a lot of little tropes in there that are Nancy Drewish, and it's called The House on 7th Street.
Okay, so The Witch of Northampton and then The House on 7th Street.
Yeah. Well, no, it's My Enemy's Tears.
My Enemy's Tears.
The Witch, The Witch of Northampton, and the House on 7th Street. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Well, so our goal here today is to talk about Pretty and to introduce it a little bit to the world. You and I are in the same position. We had books that came out last fall, and then, of course, as we know, the world kind of blew up, and a lot of authors are in the same position. So we're finding kind of creative ways to promote ourselves and each other. And I just thought doing this series of interviews would be a fun thing to do. And I have to tell you that I had the idea because of your book, Pretty, because I was so taken with it and really wanted to be able to talk to you about it more. So thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you. My goodness. Yeah, deserves the thanks.
So, Karen, can you just start out telling us kind of maybe how about a little bit of background about you? I don't want to dive into the meat of the book quite yet, but just maybe tell us a little bit about what your life is like. And
well, background is that as a writer, I started writing as a child, and I've always written, and but I always thought, you can't be a writer. You're not smart enough. You're not whatever enough, And so I really didn't get serious about writing until I was 73. So I had a book that I'd been working on for 20 years. That was My Enemy's Tears, The Witch of Northampton. I'd been working on it for many years. And so I went seriously into the editing process. I hired an editor to help. And then it was published, and I got an agent, and because I self-published the first book, and it won an award, first place in a New England festival award. And then I was approached by an agent, and she handled me for a number of years, and was able to get me some really stunning and beautiful rejection letters from the top five publishers. And so after getting going with it, I just can't stop. I'm not going to stop writing.
Well, that's wonderful, and it's something that it seems like we're seeing a lot of right now is people, they come into their retirement years and they are just finally giving in to their art, and it's visual art, it's the written word, it's music, and finding audiences. So it's just a fabulous thing, and I applaud anybody who can write a book. because it's long, arduous. There may be basically no reward ever.
Yes. In fact, when I wrote My Enemy's Tears, all I thought was, okay, so nobody's ever going to read this, but I don't care. I want to write it.
Yeah.
And so I did. And it's had a good following.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's not a bestseller on the New York Times list, but in any way like that. But it really does have a good following because an awful lot of the descendants of the characters in that book are aware and have loved reading the book. So, and others too. So, anyway.
Well, and I have to admit that that I now have those other two books on the top of my list. I'm very anxious to read your other work, and I think other people will too once they read Pretty. And let's kind of shift to Pretty a little bit because it is definitely a deviation from this other work, your first memoir, and about a really fascinating period of time. I think in U.S. history, you graduated high school in 1956.
Mhm.
Started out the books basically starts in California. I said that yesterday on the little ad that I did on Facebook that I just love that first line about the women in my family when faced with big trouble. Let me see if I
Always moved to California.
always moved to
Yeah.
California. Just
Yeah.
what a classic line.
Well, it was true.
Yeah.
Both of my grandmothers did, and then my mother did.
Hmm.
So, and um, one of my grandmothers moved there, and another one ran away there for a while and then moved back. But anyway, that's what.
But that was the solution to every problem. Moving to California, so it's really quite classic. Um,
We were in Colorado, which was hardly sophisticated in this little town in Grand Junction. It was it was only, oh, maybe 18,000 people there and really backcountry kind of place. So it's a great, beautiful place. So,
Yes, it is. I've been there, and it was one of the things that interested me about the book too. Is just this is very personal, but just knowing where it was set and being able to visualize, understanding what a gorgeous job you did with the landscape, and we'll get back to that a little bit later on. But it's worth pointing out, I think, that this book is it's also about the places in which it takes place. So we one of the things that I know we talked about earlier was the fact that this is really for you kind of a coming of age story, even separating it from you. I mean, it's about a young girl who learns a whole lot about life and living in a really short period of time, really. But the character who I found most fascinating was your mother, and she seemed to be quite ahead of her time. She was clearly an artist, a visual artist, a painter. That is something that drove her, and drove her to make decisions that took her sort of outside the family home. She rented a studio, and um, some of us might say that she even uh, as far as appearances, maybe she put herself in that art at a certain point before her children. So it seemed to me that she was part of this beginning, maybe not even beginning, but this feminist exploration that occurred post-war, where World War II had pushed women out of the house and into the factories and taking on roles that they had never had to take on before, and then of course, what that did is help everybody to understand that they could do
yeah.
all these other things. So I mean, in terms of the period of time, I saw her as being a little bit ahead, and sort of what was going to become eventually the feminist movement. Can you talk about that just a little bit, about that impacts, and then the impacts on you and your siblings, about her as far as her decisions, and then how did you make peace with that disruption in your life and your childhood, this being yanked up, moved to California? Can you kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, as far as neglecting her children and all of that sort of thing, I think it's too bad that she had to, in order to follow what her goals were in life or who she was. She was an artist. And later she took up writing also and wrote several books that were never published. Um, but she had no freedom to do any of these things. She was expected to be a housewife and wear a house dress. And when we moved to the country, off came the house dress, and she put on shorts and slacks for around the house. Of course, when we went into town, we all dressed up to teeth. You would never wear jeans or anything like that to town in that day. And so she sort of came into her own when we got out of town and into the country. And let's see, you asked something else about I forgot the rest of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, whether you saw sort of, have you, I guess you could say, have you ever thought of her in terms of that early feminist
Yeah.
way?
Yes, yeah, I know she was ahead of her time, as was my grandmother. There were two really strong women in my childhood, and but I don't think of her as a feminist because she really didn't like women. She thought women were silly because they talked about their laundry and their children, and she was interested in talking about ideas, philosophy, the arts, all of those things. And it was very hard going in a small town like Grand Junction to find people like that to be with. And so, um, does that answer your
Well,
question?
kind of. It sounds like she wasn't really. I mean, when we think of feminism, we think of equality across the genders,
Mhm.
um, and it almost seems like maybe she just didn't think about that one way or the other. She was just doing what she wanted to do.
Yes, I don't think she was thinking about that at all. I remember being really startled by some of the things she said about women because I grew up really enjoying my women friends and my girlfriends when I was young. And so I never had that dislike of women that she did. So,
Which is it's kind of interesting though too. If she had it sounds like she had a strong example in her own mother, and
yes.
so it's kind of an interesting note about her. But how did this? And if this is too personal, you don't have to answer. But I'm just curious about how the disruption of that big move played itself out in your life, if that was, and just having her be sort of focused on something besides, just the kids. Did that have any bearing on decisions you made or the way you felt about yourself subsequently?
Um, I don't think so, although I've had lots of years of therapy to, to get over my childhood, which I think is the job all of us have to do is get over our whatevers in the past. And so she was I was always kind of felt sorry for her because I knew she was unhappy, always unhappy. And so I didn't have a lot of judgments against her at all, and still don't. Although we went through a period when I was getting ready to leave the nest, where we didn't get along at all. But no, I think she was. I thank God for her now because of all I learned from her, and um, and I miss her very much since her death. She died when she was only 62. So
Oh, well, that's too bad. And but you remain close then as adults?
yes, especially after I would say the last 10 years of her life,
Hmm.
we were very close.
Hmm. Hmm.
And unfortunately, she came to visit me and was going to spend several months with me and had a heart attack and died while she was there visiting me.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Oh, that is very difficult.
yeah,
Well, can you talk about the sort of back this period of time in general? I don't want to give too much away, but you were sort of a little wild child, like many of us
yeah.
might have been. And can you just talk about how what it was like to work back through that period of time and kind of dredging up that old ground? What kind of an impact and what surprised you about that whole process?
Right. Well, the thing about doing it, it was illuminating. It was like me finally learning about my family and myself as I was doing the writing. And so it was just this process of educating myself about our lives as a family, you know. And so it was fun to write. And of course there were places where I had to cry, but it was on the whole a very good experience to write. Um, I have um, I have kind of an embarrassing revelation that came through when I was working on this about myself, and that was that the way things were in my family, I was conditioned to be a seeker of attention. Um, Everybody in the family were introverts, and Gretchen was too small. Gretchen, my youngest sister, is no longer an introvert at all, but both mother and daddy and Susan were introverts. So I was the entertainer. I was the one that had to keep the conversations going, keep the mood, lighten the mood when things got tense. So that was the big revelation I found out about myself when I was writing the book.
And how did you feel about about that discovery?
Well, I mean, I told you it's embarrassing to know that, but you know, I think a lot of people who go into the theater must have had the same sort of leanings because um, you know, a really introverted person or someone who's really satisfied with the amount of attention they get probably wouldn't head for the stage, you know.
So that's a wonderful transition to my next question, which was to ask you about your time in theater. So a good part of the book does talk about your life in the theater, and then your a number of brushes with the world of Hollywood, and I mean that was a choice that you had to make in your life if you were going to go down that road of working in the film industry. Can you talk about that a little bit? Um, and again, we don't want to give away too much of the book,
Yeah,
but
I'd
like
rather not. Well, let's see. Um, well, I wanted to be an actress, and I thought, of course, that the thing to be would be a stage actress because that would be more lofty and more important. And I wanted to be a dramatic actress because I thought that would be more intellectual. And what was the problem is I was a natural comedian. And so, of course, I didn't like myself. I didn't like who I was. I wanted to be something else. And when I got a chance to go do summer theater on Catalina Island, I spent the whole summer there playing in melodramas and comedies and did very, very well. And as a result, was given auditions for screen tests at three major studios in Hollywood. The rest of the story, I don't want to reveal what happened. So,
okay.
because of, you know, there is some suspense, I think, in in the adventures in Hollywood, and I'd like the readers to you know have that suspense.
Well, and it's an interesting thing about the book too is that glimpse inside the workings, and of course we've all heard and learned much about the inner workings of the world of film these recent years with the various allegations against some pretty prominent folks. But you, what was fascinating to me especially was that sort of that insider glimpse of what it's like to that tension between possibility um, and then what ultimately happens. It seems to be a big part of the book throughout, like what could be and then what ultimately comes. And you do a really nice job of playing with that in the writing of the book. There's some lovely tension in that way.
Good, thank you.
What so what do you wish that you had not learned about yourself during the writing of this book? And I know what you just said about the about being the center of attention, but was there anything else?
Um, Not really that I can think of right off the cuff. But I did find things that I liked about myself through the writing of the book, and and uh, they go along with my lifelong goal to learn to love myself and not be so hard on myself, and all those things that I think women do. Um, the limits we put on ourselves and how we think about ourselves, and so I think that was what I liked about writing it, but and what I learned about myself.
A lot of times in writing memoir, people will say something like it it gave them a way to sort of take ownership of what had happened to them and the choices that they made. So it can be really transformative in that way. Do you
Yeah.
feel is that
Yes,
you?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it is transformative. Um, to look and to learn about who you are. Uh, I think everybody should write a coming of age story, even if they're not writers, to think through their coming of age, because you know how many books have been written. I mean, coming of age is almost a genre, or it is a genre. So people like reading stories like that about how people made it through adolescence and onward. And so, um, yeah.
Just to shift gears a little bit, and I know we didn't talk about this really head on, but just about your father. I tend to focus my interest on your mother, and your father's there. He's a little bit shadowy, and your siblings are a little bit shadowy too. It really does seem the focus of the story is on your mother and you. But could you talk about your father's role in this a little bit? How he responded to your mother wanting to be an artist and being out of the house, and maybe how those kind of the tectonic plates of those two sets of expectations and how those worked.
Yeah. My father was a typical 50s father. His role was to go to work and provide a good living for the family. And that was what he was interested in, other than sports and fishing and playing poker with his friends sometimes once a week. He really was not an introspective person. He did not he did not look inside of himself or inside of anyone else. Um, he was an introvert, as I said, and he also had a drinking problem, um, which years later, he solved. I was very proud of him. He came away from all that. He did this little trip that a lot of people do, as starting out as a social drinker, and then it expanded and expanded and got worse as he aged until he was very sick with the DTs, etc. But what his alcoholism did inside the marriage and with the children was to distance himself. It's the way he removed himself from all of us. He just became quieter, quieter, quieter. And I never heard my parents fight. There was this silence I describe in the book throughout the house and between them. So I don't.
So,
Did I answer the question?
yeah, you did. It's just sort of stirring up some other questions. So, when you and this is one of those, if it's too personal, just say so. When it came to making peace with that childhood, were you making peace more with what you suffered at his hand or what you suffered at your mother's hand?
Good question. Let me think. Mother's hand. I had to deal with both. I can't say one more than the other. Because my mother wanted to make me into somebody of her choosing, and my father just didn't notice me at all. So it was like too much attention from one, maybe, and nearly none at all from the other.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I have come to the place. I couldn't have written the book if I hadn't first come to the place of understanding both of those people,
Mm-hmm.
and how they couldn't have been any different than the way they were, and they were doing the best they could. But a lot of people say my parents did the best they could, but you have to look first and understand who they were in order for you to get free of them. So,
yes. Yes, and that's so powerful. It's such a powerful thing in our lives, which of course is the value of memoir, because the people who can tell the stories of what happened to them, and then other folks can relate and start their own explorations based on that. But I love that take that our parents didn't get a playbook either. No more than we did, and then of course we turn around and make our own a different set of mistakes with our kids, and then they spend their own time in therapy and get it all figured out. But I just think it's marvelous. And I know that you and I talked about this already, but one of the marvelous things about this book was the lack of judgment. There was never a hint, even though people were doing things that maybe some of us wouldn't like, or thought that were a little bit despicable, even for parents. There was no sense that you were judging them at all. It's just a very objective kind of storytelling that just brought this other wonderful layer of love and forgiveness to the story that was also important. It was just it was like a golden thread through the whole piece. That sense of forgiveness. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when you're going to write memoir, you need to forgive first.
Thank you. I would agree with that. It can't be about tearing somebody up publicly.
No, and people don't want to read you doing your therapy either.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, and it can't be just about airing dirty laundry or any of that.
Really famous. If you're really famous, you've got really glitzy laundry, dirty laundry. Well, maybe.
Maybe. Well, there's that. The celebrity dirty laundry. um, so then also, one of the things I mentioned earlier is just this kind of relationship with the land and the landscape that it seemed like when we talked before, you weren't really 100% conscious of as you were writing the book, but I think you kind of admitted that it did sort of manifest itself that way. So can you talk about that a little bit? Your
Well,
relationship to landscape and your awareness of landscape, even at that early age.
yes, I was aware. I mean, the landscape in Colorado is unavoidable. I mean, it is stunning. It is colorful. It is monumental. It is towering mountains. It's, sandstone pillars. It's there's no way you can get through it without noticing it. So, and of course, I was the kind of child that was I don't know, I felt a connection to the land. I felt it was where I belonged and all of that. So it was all part of my feelings for my childhood and where I lived. And I think all my books are full of landscapes, full of the detail of where the action's taking place, and how it's affecting the people in in the story. So, yeah.
That's what I saw is kind of the landscapes in Colorado being so dramatic, and of course drama being all about what you were about at the time. It just there was a nice resonance there
Oh,
um, between between the land, but I just thought it was unique that someone at that age would have such an obvious relationship with the formations around them.
yeah.
Um, and then, of course, getting to California was a completely different set of circumstances, not just in terms of the horizon, but in terms of the culture too, which also created an interesting shift in the book as you move from one place to the other, and the sense of those two different places manifest themselves in
Yes.
your life.
California was a lifesaver for me. And, I will never stop thanking the people in California who are still my friends and who helped me make a success of myself in my senior year. I moved the summer before my senior year. So that could have been a traumatic
Mhm.
move, and it wasn't. It was beautifully handled by the people that received me there.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. And that part is clear too. Just another lovely thing. Um, Not everybody meets that kind of reception when they run off to California.
oh no, no, I was just blessed, lucky. Yeah. So,
Can, this is another question that I'm kind of throwing at you, but can you talk about the title and the meaning of the title?
well, I from the beginning I wanted to call it pretty, and mainly because I was called pretty a lot
Mhm.
by uh, Jim, the man I married, and um, and it was the only gift I had was I thought was that I was pretty. I thought I was not intelligent because I didn't get good grades in school, and I thought I was bad because I was just a bad girl. And so the only thing I could uh, take to my heart was being pretty. I mean, that was my advantage. And yet I realized that nobody has any control. over how they look. There was nothing I did to deserve how I looked. It was just, you know, the genes coming together. I had nothing to do with it, but so it was being pretty was sort of the source from which I sprung, so to speak, you know. And so I wanted the title to be that. I I think the publisher would have liked a different title, but she allowed me to keep it. And so I wonder what you think about the title.
Well,
You know,
I find there's a wonderful resonance with our particular era
yeah,
because we are finally, after how many thousands of years, figuring out that this disconnect between body image and the way our bodies, the female body, the female form has been objectified, and how we're all indoctrinated in that way to think that our our big gift is how we look outwardly to the world, and we know all the psychological struggles that this creates for women. And I'm very grateful for the Me Too movement because I feel like it's in the face of the male faction that you got to stop thinking about us this way.
yes,
This is toxic, and we're not just bodies, and we're not just objects to be used for marketing um,
yeah,
items for sale. This is
yes,
actually, there's a full flesh and blood human being here with great capability, with great potential. And so that, to me, that title went through me like a gong being hit, because that is, so many of us have that same thing,
yes,
um, that we are just considered based on the way we look, and that's as far as anybody else goes, and that's at the root of not only sexism but racism, and it has to be looked at, and I think a book like this really kind of puts it, once again, sort of in our faces. This is a very talented young girl who thought the only thing she had going for her was the way she looked, and so, yeah, well, what do? You take that and you turn it into currency, and
right. Well,
again, not wanting to tell too much, but
yeah, and because I was going to college was cut out from under me, and I couldn't continue in college. Um, that sort of went along with me um, to confirm that I was not intelligent. Um, as I aged. And I think it was in my 40s that I realized that I was intelligent, that I had, I did a lot self-education. I read a lot. I traveled. Um, I had many interests that I had to learn how to carry on in order to um, continue my interests. I had to learn how to apply them. So the you can educate yourself without a college education, but I was always ashamed that I didn't have one, and so um, and I'm not anymore. That doesn't bother me now because I understand more. Although all my friends, I have friends who have doctorates and master's degrees, and I have a lot of very well educated friends, and they like me. I don't have a degree.
well, I used to, as you know, I taught for many years in higher ed, and I used to talk to students about this, quite frankly, that that getting a degree is about buying into a certain system, and it isn't necessarily the be all and end all in terms of education. In fact, sometimes I think, we're our higher ed right now is just long-term vo-tech as much as anything. We're no longer really getting educations. We're getting training of a certain kind. Um, so I just always yes, I drank that Kool-Aid, and yes, I have higher degrees, but they didn't do for me what I thought they were going to do for me. So if that helps at all, they
Oh,
didn't change me.
I,
I'm still
I'm
who I
fine
was.
now. I'm fine with who I am now. Absolutely.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but it was a process getting here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm glad I got to live to be so old, so so I could get through it all.
Well, we're very glad too, and of course, I just sort of share with the audience that I was pretty sure there was a misprint in the book when it said that you graduated high school in 1956. I didn't see how that was possible, but
Yeah. Oh, I just turned 82, so it's
well,
possible. Yeah.
that's wonderful. You are my touchstone from here on.
Thank you.
So,
Goodness.
so, and so another question. This is more about writing process, but memoir is particularly difficult to write. I think because, as we've said, life is full of so much minutia, and lots of things happening every single day, and floods of emotion and transformation and transition over time. Um, how do you decide? How did you decide? I mean, I'm guessing you must have had there must be lots on the cutting room floor. In writing memoir, how did you decide what details to include, what occurrences, what scenes?
Well, it's kind of hilarious. The first draft of this book was over 1,000 words, and um, it was it rambled on about every member of my family and
Sorry, 1,000 words or 1,000 pages?
well, I don't remember what it is, but the the cover that's on the first draft is about that. It's about that thick.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, I should have looked that up to find out exactly how many words it was, but it was long,
Uh-huh.
and I covered everything. I I could have described the tablecloths and the everything, but then I decided that I needed to combine some characters because I couldn't really write a book about every boy I kissed or every girlfriend I had. So I combined some of the men in the story into one or two or three men, and then I combined the girlfriends into one or two. And I left out my grandparents because I put them in another book, in the mystery story. They're in that book. And my sisters, I sketched because I could write a whole book on my sisters. So what I had to do is cut it down to just the basic story of me and how I made it through the first 20 years of my life in that family.
Mhm.
So um, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess I just wondered if and it sounds like it did. Just ultimately, you decided that there was a smaller story to tell.
Yes, there is.
And
I mean, there are many stories to tell from that time. I could write, as I say, a book about my sisters, and um, yeah, it's you have to get to the sort of the center of it, what it is you want to get across. And I finished up the last of it during a time after the Me Too movement, so I wanted to focus on that aspect of it, and um, and then of course there are editors that come along in your life when you're being published, and they have opinions about what goes and what stays. So and then rewriting and rewriting. And so that's how it went.
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned the Me Too movement again, because I sort of felt like this is a book for that movement. It the timing of the release of it is interesting to me because I feel like it manifests the energy of that movement, and this is like a snapshot of what it's like for one girl to have come up in the United States in this culture that we have that objectifies and denigrates the physical aspect of women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's quite an eye opener in that way. What could you since we're talking along those lines, could you tell us what you might have to say to that Karen, to the Karen in Pretty? What you would say to her right now?
Oh, I'm still saying it to her. Don't be so hard on yourself. Don't grow up to be so hard on yourself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what I would say to her. And um, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And do you have any? You said you're working on another book right now. Is that?
Oh, yeah. I have another memoir that I'm writing, and it's on the shelf while I'm finishing a historical fiction that I
Oh,
started years and years ago. And it's, I think, going to be the pinnacle for me if I can get this book written, because it's very difficult. It's because I'm a pretty exacting historian, and actually, I don't read historical fiction much because a lot of the people writing historical fiction want to sugarcoat history and make their heroines modern women, usually liberal women, and so I want to write the truth of history and tell this story. So it's very slow going, and it's sometimes I wonder if I'm up to it, but I'm still trying.
still
So
going for it.
yeah,
Well, that's exciting news to know that there's more in the pipeline. And
yeah.
then I guess lastly, and this is kind of the classic question, but for anybody else who wants to write, what do you have to say to them? What advice or thoughts do you have for them?
Well, there are lots of things you can learn about the writing life and about writing itself. But I truly believe that if you're a writer, you know it because you have to write. And I mean, you can't go forward without writing, because it's so important in your life. And so there's lots to learn. In fact, I have a little. It's right here above my computer, right here. It's a little sign I made, and it says "habit, not inspiration." And so that's what I look at when I sit down to write is don't wait for inspiration, just write.
Mm-hmm.
And um, that would be my best advice, I think. So
So, butt in the chair.
in the chair, yes, that's
Yeah.
it.
Well, Karen, thank you so much for talking to me today, and I just delightful to get to know you, and I have a feeling I'll be doing another reading of Pretty at some time in the future. It's not one I'm going to easily let go of, and I think I told you it's one I'm recommending to people now when I teach memoir writing classes. So just really lovely, and I just want to one last pitch. Hopefully, people can see it for Pretty by Karen Vorbeck Williams, and then two other books as well. My Enemy's Tears, The Witch of Northampton, and House on
7th Street.
7th Street. And
Yeah.
sorry, I
That's
didn't have
also
those right for me.
that's a Grand Junction story also. Yeah.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's very good to know. And then just also make sure that you avoid the corporate demons. Order from your local bookstore, either
Yes. Yeah.
through calling them directly or through IndieBound. All
Yes.
right. All right, Karen, thank you
Oh, thank
again.
you, Paula. I mean, I'm just overwhelmed by your generosity, and I really thank you so much. And maybe someday I'll interview you about the wonderful book I just read of yours that came out last fall. Somebody should have scolded that girl.
Well,
Yeah.
and thank you for bringing it up. We'll just give a little plug and let people know that we do have another interview planned to sort of talk about that and writing, and folks can be on the lookout for that.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, and if
Thank
you
you.
just want to, I'll have you hold on just one moment here.
Okay.
Okay, and thanks to our audience, and we hope to see everyone again soon.